Hello and welcome to this Guardian Live event. My name is David Olusoga. I'm a historian and a broadcaster. And tonight I'm delighted to be talking with my friend, the actor, the director, and the advocate for mental health and author, David Harewood. We're here to talk about David's candid memoir, Maybe I Don't Belong Here. The book charts his personal journey, his personal life, his early years from a breakdown to recovery. And it explores how systematic racism impacts upon Black mental health. And tonight we'll be discussing David's story and exploring how biases continue to shape perceptions of mental health and whether the environment that contributed to David's experiences has really changed. So, David Harewood, hello and welcome.
Thank you for inviting me. Good to be here and good to see you.
Wonderful. Well, before I ask my first question, just to explain how things are going to work, David and I will talk for about 40 minutes, but we really want to hear from you as well. So please do use send your questions via the Q&A button, and we'll try to get through as many as we can in the last section of the event. But do tell us your name and where you're joining us from. But David, if I may begin by saying it's been a while since the book was published, about 18 months, is that about right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You've been on, literally, because you've been touring on a book tour, but literally and figuratively, you've been on quite a journey with this story since then, haven't you?
I have. I think, to be honest with you, ever since I started, almost, let's say reluctantly, but inadvertently, let slip publicly about my breakdown. It's been a massive journey from tweeting out that I'd had this breakdown to then writing an article for The Guardian, to then doing a documentary where I investigated the reason for my breakdown, to then writing a book about my entire life and how that breakdown came to be. It's been a massive journey that I've been on, I would say, for just over 2 years since I first sent that tweet out. And it's one that was being, I've got to be honest with you, very painful at first. Very dislocating, very upsetting. But along the journey, I think I've really began to put some of the pieces of my life together. And as a result of sort of digging around in stuff that people probably told me was best left settled. As a result of digging around in it, I think I've come to a place of real strength with it all and understanding with it all that has made me a much stronger person. So it's been a tough journey, but I would say a necessary one. And I'm glad that I did it.
And a big step in that journey was you making a documentary with the BBC that was a sort of journey back to that moment in your younger years when you had an experience of psychosis. Can you tell me about the process of making that documentary and the episodes it opened up in your life?
Yeah. So I, as I said, briefly said at the beginning, I sent a tweet out on World Mental Health Day about 2 years ago, saying, as somebody who's had a breakdown, glibly saying, as somebody who's had a breakdown, just want to say, look after yourself today. It's totally recoverable. Look after yourself. Get some help if you can. Sent the tweet, got on a plane, flew off to America, turned my phone on, 40,000 retweets. And I was suddenly sort of thrust into my breakdown is suddenly made very, very public. From that action, I wrote an article for The Guardian and about what I thought was my breakdown, a memory of my breakdown. And a friend of mine who was with me whilst I was experiencing my psychosis read the article in The Guardian and was remarked to have said, "That's not how I remember it." So I was instantly thought, well, have I misread this? Have I sort of forgotten, or have I, other things that I've not been my memory isn't accurate about? So I sort of pitched the idea of a documentary to the BBC, and they decided to do it. And because I was working abroad at the time, and I chose not to engage with the documentary very much, and just allow the experience to sort of happened for me in the moment. And that's where I sort of became undone, because when they presented my medical records, there's a scene where I'm supposed to go back to the Whittington Psychiatric Hospital, which is where I was sectioned. And I'm supposed to get my medical records and then discuss them, reopen them. And I didn't even know they existed. So the BBC found my medical records in the bowels of the Whittington Psychiatric Hospital and then printed them out and gave them to me. It was a really powerful, frightening, scary moment when I opened these notes, which I said I'd never seen before, and read. David, it was really disturbing because it's like reading your disturbed self. But all of it was about my race. All of the things I was saying was about my race and my confusion around my identity and I closed the envelope and I said, cut, not doing this. And I panicked really because I thought I was suddenly taken back to where I was 30 years before. And I'd obviously buried all that trauma, but obviously buried all that confusion and pain. And here it was staring me in the face. And I'd never really dealt with it. I'd never really dealt with that confusion or pain around my identity, my blackness, lack of blackness, not being black enough, dismissing, all of the stuff I was experiencing when I came out of drama school. All that pain, I'd sort of buried it. And suddenly here it was, staring me in the face. And the rest of the documentary was really difficult for me to shoot because I was constantly aware that I had misremembered my experience and was really scared that I might find something else which might destabilize me. So it was a scary documentary to film. I was glad I made it and glad I finished it. But I didn't read my medical records again until George Floyd was murdered.
So the documentary went out. BBC got the documentary. They gave you the envelope with your notes. What happened when the documentary was broadcast?
Again, I was astonished, really, because normally as an actor you have this sort of bulletproof sort of invincibility cloak where people sort of people don't approach you because you're the guy after telling and they don't want to disturb you. But suddenly that cloak was gone and I was David Harewood. So people were just coming up to me in the street, on the tube, anywhere, and engaging me in conversation about the documentary. Complete strangers, some of whom had experience of psychosis. Lots of mums whose sons had psychosis, white and black. A couple of black people who approached me to tell me that their elders had died while being restrained. So I was suddenly thrust into this really experiential experience where I'd be sobbing on the street with complete strangers who were talking about psychosis. And psychosis is a really traumatizing experience, not just for the person going through it, but for the person witnessing them going through it. So oftentimes I just find myself sobbing with complete strangers who were telling me about their moms or their sons or their dads or their brothers who had experienced psychosis. And it was only from seeing the documentary that they thought, oh, this isn't just happening to me. This is a condition. This is something that happens to everybody. And I wasn't aware that it was so taboo or that nobody talks about it. I think the next day after the documentary went out, the charity Mind told me that calls about psychosis rose 107% because suddenly people were going, oh, that's what happened to Uncle Tommy. Oh, that's what happened to my... People suddenly could frame the experience in psychosis. And that's only just got more and more. The people slide into my DMs all week as I've been talking about the book. People have been saying, where can I get this book? Where can I see the documentary? Because my son's just been sectioned and everyone's terrified. And so in a sense, almost, without really understanding it, I sort of perhaps performed a bit of a public service because people now use it as a resource tool to try and understand understand what the experience is. And I think seeing my success, perhaps as an actor, has given them hope that, their loved ones can recover from it.
So really, inadvertently, what began as a sort of an admission on social media, a personal, something sent out there to be supportive of other people, led to a documentary, and it led to you being placed very much at the center of a debate that hadn't really been allowed to happen, a discussion that many people felt too nervous to have, and suddenly you're the poster boy, as it were, of this urge, this strong desire to discuss what many people think of as taboo.
Yes, and I think so. And then when you then link this subject of mental health in the Black community, mental health and racism, I think the whole trifecta of taboo, we don't talk about this, has really started to emerge. And I really have been astonished at the amount of Black people just recently who have been telling me about their experiences in the mental health system, or their experience of their sons or their brothers or family members in the mental health system, and just wanted to say thank you, because we just don't talk about it. My son's almost ashamed of his breakdown, and actually now reading about your experience, he's thinking, well, actually maybe I don't need to be ashamed of it. It's and what I've tried to do is really sort of uncover why I think it happened, and maybe we'll get into that later. And I think it's the why I think it happened. Obviously, it happens to not just Black people. So everybody's psychosis is different. But I think there's a specificity to racism's place in and Britain's living in England, living in a Western society. There is a specificity to that experience when you're Black that can have a very detrimental effect on your sense of self, identity, and mental health.
To frame it within your experiences of these 2 years, at this point, the documentary's gone out. You've discovered this desperately needed conversation that you've been placed at the middle of it. You've got this envelope that you haven't really looked at, full of your medical notes, and then we have COVID.
Yeah, I mean. COVID was everyone's different, and I know some people got slaughtered for saying this, but I actually had a good lockdown. I had a great pandemic. It was the first time I'd ever stopped. First time I'd stopped working in 10 years. So I was at home, and that was really nice. The weather was great in that first lockdown, and then George Floyd. It was after George Floyd was murdered, and there was this wave of empathy which spread around the world. I remember seeing marches in Brazil, marches in Sweden, Denmark. There were these marches all over the world in support of Black lives and Black Lives Matter and justice. And I just got this sense listening to the radio, and got this sense that people in Britain were going, "Oh, that's an American problem. We don't have racism in the UK. We don't have burning crosses." And I just got this sense from the press here that racism was uniquely American. And so I sat down and I wrote, for some reason, I'd been asked to write a book, and I hadn't started it yet. But I wrote 2 chapters straight out about my history, my youth growing up. At the time, I didn't know I was writing the book, but I just started writing this stuff down. And then my agent encouraged me to continue writing. But I knew I couldn't write the full book, David, until I got back to Vancouver, which is where I was filming, which was where my medical records were. So I wrote 2 chapters and then had a break. And then when the film industry started getting back up and running, literally the first thing I did was fly into Vancouver, fly into 14-day quarantine, just me on my own in a flat in Vancouver. I dug out those medical records and I read them cover to cover.
So the envelope
the
envelope that you hadn't been able, the contents you hadn't found yourself able to confront when you were making the documentary, suddenly there's a desire, a need to really confront this.
I had to look at it. I knew there was stuff in there that I really had to face. And whilst it was really uncomfortable looking at it while I was making the documentary, I felt I was in a stronger place, more secure place. Because I think after the documentary, I sought out a therapist, specifically a Black therapist, because I felt there was a specificity to what I needed to work out and understand. So I sought out a Black male therapist, and for 2 years after the documentary, I was in regular therapy, discussing all my insecurities, my vulnerabilities, in the safe space of a non-judgmental environment, and that's been tremendously helpful for me to negotiate that space, and I feel much better. So I felt like I was in a better place to absorb this material, and I was shocked at it. I was really shocked at it, and I sent my records to a consultant psychiatrist, and she was the one who actually told me. She said it's extraordinary how many times when you were sectioned that you were referred to as a large Black man, not David, not Mr. Harewood, just a large Black man woke up this morning. Large Black man went for his meal today. Large Black man ate, and I suddenly thought, wow, I was almost, I was a non-person in there. I was
de-individualized.
Exactly, and also I was over-medicated. I was given 3 times the legal dose of tranquilizers. I never knew that, but I never knew that was even a thing. But again, since writing the book, I've been told that is standard practice. Can be standard practice in certain situations when somebody is sectioned, because people are scared of large Black men. So if you're a big Black man, you will be almost routinely over-medicated. So all this stuff, I'm starting to talk about all this stuff, and so it's kind of thrown a bit of a grenade into standards and practices, and really brought attention to the lack of care that can be ascribed to anybody who is a person of color.
At the point of your breakdown, you were in your mid-20s.
Mm.
And what those notes showed was that you were not seen as an individual, you were not seen as a young man. You were seen as this trope, the large Black man. Reading your notes and other investigations in conversations with people who'd known you at the time, what you discovered from reading the book, it seems to me that's really powerful, is not just that other people framed you through this racial trope. It's that race and your experiences of racism had been foundation to the psychosis that you experienced. And that was something else you had to confront.
Yeah, and that was really quite painful again, because you look back and to see growing up in the country, it really took me back to, in my experience of growing up in Birmingham as a kid, being afraid to leave the house, because you didn't know, you didn't know where you were going to get chased, how you were going to get chased, what you were going to be chased with, who by. And I remember this growing sense of fear when you left the house as a child in Birmingham, the sense that you were under threat. And as I've dug around in this area and put myself into my kind of youthful persona, growing up in a country where, the black and white minstrel show was regular Saturday night entertainment. And even I knew as a kid, I thought, there's something wrong here. I couldn't articulate it, but I was confused as to what I was watching. They weren't black, and they didn't represent me. And yet, here they are sort of dancing and singing. And so I was growing up in this environment where there were no images of, well, certainly very few positive images of black people, except these grotesque figures on the television where Alf Garnett continued to regularly use the words wogs and coon, and which was followed by canned laughter. And yet there was no canned laughter on the street when people called me a wog or a coon. So I'm amazed that sort of growing up it didn't surprise me that growing up in an environment like that, played a part in sort of confusing my sense of self, really.
I have to say, we're about the same age. I mean, one of the things that I took from reading your documentary was it made me really realize how much I'd edited out of my experiences of racial violence in Britain. And it was almost the reading somebody else. And I've often said that we need an oral history of what happened in Britain in the 70s and 80s, just how racist Britain was, how much racial violence there was. And it was almost like I'd started almost to disbelieve those things that happened to me. And reading, I think for young Black people in this country, the National Front doesn't really mean anything anymore, wonderfully, thankfully. But they were a huge force in my childhood. And actually, I don't think I've read anything other than your biography that reminded me, I was frightened of people who might attack me because they were part of a right-wing street political party of thugs that existed in our country throughout my childhood. So I know many people have been inspired by that felt legitimated by reading about your psychosis. For me, the racism you experienced, which of course is part of the reason for your psychosis, was graphically and very openly explored in your book. Now that itself must have been painful.
Yeah, it was, because also I had to, as you just said, David, and bravely, I have to pick you up on that, because you said that you were scared, and I had to sort of kind of own up and admit that I was terrified as a kid. I wasn't the big strapping lads going out going, let's go and fight these skinheads. I was terrified by it. So I sort of lived in fear of, being attacked, randomly verbally attacked on the way home from school. You get somebody calling you nigger or coon, and the tension, the fear that would go through me. And that reminded me, and I think I felt a little bit of shame around that. And again, I've sort of been dealing with that, and I talk about that in my sessions and how I've sort of broken through that shame. And because what you should have been afraid, because they would have caused you serious damage. But also, I think, I think that, talking about it has made me understand, in a sense, my father's because my father had a breakdown too. And, it's made me think about that generation and why they were so, why I've got so much respect for them, and why not many of them talk about this experience. Not many of them talk about the experience of what it was actually like coming to the UK. And I'm not surprised, because it must have been pretty traumatic. You get on a ship in Barbados in blazing heat, in just a suit and, maybe a trench coat, over your arm and a hat, thinking about coming to the mother country, the excitement of coming to England. And then you get off at Southampton, it's freezing, it's grey, it's cold, and people are spitting at you and refusing to take you, refusing to let you stay in their house, and not wanting to touch money that you touched. And, it must have been a real shock to them. And it's not surprising that they didn't speak about it. It's not surprising that we don't. And I think, again, when I frame this in the sort of schism of mental health, that trauma, which was probably internalized, I think does pass down generationally in some respects. And I think, as you said, we've edited out. We edit out the discomfort, as I did. I buried the discomfort, hoping we'll just ignore it. We'll just move on. We'll just assimilate into the culture, and hope it all goes away. And I think my assimilation took the place of burying all my discomfort, because I could only really, and this is again where there's shame, I could only really sort of kind of immerse myself in blackness and in my identity as a black person through pain, through trauma. When somebody calls you a nigger or coon, and then you're a black, because otherwise you just forget it. You're just a kid playing football, or you're a kid playing on the street. You don't think you're a black kid playing on the street until somebody goes, "Oi, nigger, go back to where you came from." That's when I sort of, so I think in my head, I had no relationship with my black identity, because I didn't want to deal with pain and trauma. So I just assimilated and just thought, no, I'm just going to get on with life and assimilate, become English, become British, not talk about race, just get on with it, be normal, just get on with it. So, and then as we talk about in my book, how you find yourself in the white space being in a predominantly white environment, which was school, predominantly white environment, which was RADA. And then I came out of RADA, came out of drama school, and suddenly, bang, the world said to me, "Oi, you're black." And it really, I mean, I couldn't go for this part because that part or this other part. So suddenly that lens of you are black, and you've got to realize that. And I think naively, I'd probably forgotten about it.
And so you're 21 years old. You've come out of acting school. You've come out of the most prestigious acting school there is, and that happy period in RADA had perhaps created expectations that you might have a freer career, that race would not be such a factor, because of the playground that is university, no matter what you're studying, and that there was a really rude awakening on graduating from RADA.
It was a massive awakening. It was, and again, and this was the time when we were the sort of first generation of British-born, classically trained actors. And, people were walking out at the RSC because there was a black Richard III. People were getting up and shouting in Stratford when a black King of France came on. And, the reviews were constantly sort of negative, constantly dismissive. Some of them are very deeply personal for me, where, I played Romeo when I came out of drama school. And one reviewer said, he doesn't look like Romeo, he looks more like Mike Tyson. And so the reviews were very personal. And one reviewer said, apparently this young man went to RADA. Why did they let him in? Why did they let him out? It was really, really personal. And I ended up having to stop reading them because it was really destabilizing me. I was losing confidence. And I really felt like I was being dismissed. They were, I guess I had a hope that they were going to say, "Oh, who is this new young kid come out of drama school?" But it was anything but. It was very, very hostile.
And very much focused on race.
Very much focused on race, yeah. Black people can't do Shakespeare. Why are they doing? Even when I played Othello at the National, I was the first black actor to play Othello at the National.
Which is in itself astonishing.
It is in itself astonishing. That was in 1997, and there hasn't been a black actor black up in America to play Othello since 1935. So you can imagine how behind the curve we are. But I lost my train there. But it was deeply upsetting for me. And then on top of that, because I was also I speak quite well, trained, rather trained, and I'm this kind of clipped English boy. I was then also rejected by the black community because I wasn't black enough. And
so how did that manifest, that rejection?
Oh God! In sort of being ostracized in certain environments. I was doing a play, my second play out of drama school. I was doing a play in black theatre, and my character was in an interracial relationship and was trying to make everything work. And my brother was this very militant character who had all these zingers, real zingers, from Sell Out to Uncle Tom to Coconut, all of these zingers, which went down a storm with the black audience. So I felt as though the black audience were laughing at me rather than at the character. They were laughing at me. And that's where I started to sort of become a little undone, because once I felt I was rejected not only by the white space, but then the black space. That's when things started to take a very dark turn for me. The only way I could get on stage, because I was very unhappy then as an actor, second job out of drama school, and I was deeply unhappy with my experience and my experience of the profession. And the only way I could get on stage was to be fairly drunk, and started drinking before I went on stage, topped up with drinking after stage. And that's where the spiral of psychosis began for me. The negative thinking, lack of sleep, substance abuse, both smoking and drinking, and allowed the psychosis to really develop and take hold.
You say in the book, and I'm going to quote you here, you say, I was Black and I had completely underestimated the significance of that reality. Then you find yourself, after coming from a community with unacknowledged trauma, having experienced racial violence and the trauma that comes with that, and now having this reality, people defining you through this reality. You talk about a sort of crack in your mind between self-perception and how the world perceived you. Can you explain more about what you mean by that fissure that broke?
Yeah, I guess a lot of it started when I was a child. I write in the book about my very first personal experience of racism, British racism, with an old white guy walking up to me, and so I was about 7 years old, playing outside my house, and an elderly white gentleman came up to me. I don't know whether I can swear on The Guardian, but he said, "Get the fuck out of my country, you little black bastard." And I was sort of rooted to the spot. I had never heard that word before. I'd never experienced that in-your-face racism. He screamed at me, and then he walked off. And I stood there rooted to the spot, and I just didn't understand what he meant. But slowly I started thinking, oh, I'm Black. Maybe he said it's his country. Maybe I'm not supposed to be here, which is why the book is called Maybe I Don't Belong Here. Because that question that's when the crack started for me. That's when the question started to go, well, maybe I don't belong here. Maybe I'm not. And then, so for years afterwards, and people always just say to me, go back to where you came from. I was always thinking, what does that mean? I don't understand what that means. I'm British, I'm English, I'm from here, but here, my home is exactly the same place that I'm also being rejected from. So there's this sort of split where my Black consciousness doesn't marry with my English consciousness. And this sense of identity and self is confused a little, and that was a little fissure, a little crack, which I tried to bury and you try and dance through that as I got older and older. This sense of this dislocation between my Black identity and my British identity. The more British I feel, the less Black I feel. The more Black I feel, the less British I feel. So I'm trying to make these two halves of myself work and in combination, and make both halves of myself happy and content. So it was an effort to try and keep that sort of keep these two halves of me together and working well together. But when my psychosis started, I completely lost that battle. And as you said, the world was very much treating me as a Black person. But in my mind, I was saying, no, I can do whatever because I'm an actor. I can escape my Blackness. I can play this. I can play that. So I was sort of overthinking my experience and overthinking my in my efforts to sort of free myself artistically from what I was being given. You can only play Black parts. I can do anything. So I think in this effort to sort of break free of this box that I was being put in, I think that was really when things started to really come apart. And that's when I sort of lost my mind.
And at this most incredibly acutely vulnerable moment in your life, you're 23 years old, you're 2 years out of RADA, you're drinking too much, you're having this fissure in your mind, you have a psychosis, and of course the people who need to treat you are from a medical profession, from a world of psychosis treatment that's also affected by racial thinking.
Yeah, and I also say in the book that mental health facility is really the wrong place to be othered. It's the wrong place to experience racism because you are in a very, very vulnerable position and you need help. I was the only Black person on my ward. I don't remember there being any other white faces. I was very, very scared of everybody that was around me. So I was very lucky that my mother was very strong and absolutely demanded that nobody medicate me more than I needed to be. And, she came down and she was very forceful. So, without her, I think things could have got a bit hairy. But I can also understand, as a result of that, David, why Black people are reluctant to enter the mental health system, because that's not a really, again, if your experience is a negative one in there, excuse me, 1 second. If your experience is a negative one in there, you're highly likely to not want to enter the mental health system. And many people, which is one of the reasons why Black people in particular usually only enter the mental health system at points of crisis, which is when they're being restrained, when they're being medicated, when the police are called. And that's really dangerous, because there's a fear of entering a system where you're going to be othered, where you are going to be, people are not going to understand your concerns. There's a buildup of resentments, and those resentments could be racial, not getting promotion, not getting, not being treated right at work, not all these years that are building up, the microaggressions. They can come out when you're in a psychosis. They can come out in unruly behavior, in disturbed behavior, and people are afraid of large Black men who are disturbed. The footballer Daniel Atkinson, you've got tasered that way. It's many people here in America get shot that way. It's if you're a large Black man, chances are, unless you seek help yourself, you probably will end up either criminalized, arrested, or restrained, quite physically.
And your experiences, they were in a psychiatric hospital called Hollymore. How did the journey of recovery that had to start there, how did you make the first steps on that journey?
Well, because I was sectioned twice. First time in Whittington Psychiatric Hospital in North London, and then the second time in the Hollymore Hospital in Birmingham. And as soon as I realized that the doors of the second time rather, as soon as I realized the doors of the hospital were locked, the doors of the ward were locked, I instantly knew I'd talked myself back into the facility. And I was really pissed off with myself. I thought I was getting better, but I'd probably, again, there was probably a bit of substance abuse when I was still on medication, which probably wasn't a good idea. Well, it's not a good idea. And I'd found myself spiraling again. My mother had to resection me. But once I couldn't get off that ward the very next morning, I was like, I need to get out of here. And it was like the Shawshank Redemption. I made these plans to get out, and part of those plans to get out are just behave, tone down all the questions, do exactly what they say, take the medication when you're supposed to take. Because at first you're like, I'm taking it. You can get quite angsty, and you can get nervous, and you can start being a bit agitated and refusing to take the medication. And I just said to myself, I need to get out of here. So I think this is where my acting ability came in, because I said to myself, I'm going to be the nicest, calmest Black person on this ward, and I'm going to get out. So I took all my medication, and I did. I made a show every morning of brushing my teeth and washing my face and trying to say hello to the nurses and be very nice and be very conversational. And I did everything I could to convince everybody that I was normal. And it was because my brother. That's what my brother invited me. My brother came to see me, and he said, if you want to get out of here, you got to start acting normal. And I thought, act normal. I can act. So I literally it was the greatest performance of my life, I think, where I literally every day I restrained myself from anything too outspoken. I took the medication. I did everything everybody told me to do, and within 5 days I was released.
We've got questions coming in, and I don't want to ask too many, but I want to ask one other question. I mean, is it the case really that your recovery happened after you left? Your recovery was something that you had to do yourself?
David, I would say my recovery is still happening to this day. I don't think. I really had to build another David Harewood. I had to build another persona because I felt like that young kid had collapsed, and I talk about that in the book. It's a very traumatizing experience, psychosis, which is why I answer everybody that approaches me on Twitter or in the street or on my Instagram feed. Since I've been talking about this, I know exactly what that's like. So I try and answer everybody. And I say to them, look, I say to them, particularly mothers who see their son, bright kids, straight A's at university within a term having a psychotic breakdown. It doesn't matter how intelligent you are. It doesn't matter what race you are. Psychosis can happen to anybody. And I try and tell them that there is a recovery, there is a road back. But it takes a lot of work and it takes a lot of time. But I really do think, yes, you're right, but it did happen. The recovery started after I left, but the recovery is ongoing. And had I not been through this experience and recovered that experience from the documentary to writing the book to doing the documentary, I wouldn't be the person I am today. So re-engaging with that pain, understanding it has been fundamental to who I am. So I think the recovery is ongoing.
So it would be fair to say that this is a book that records not just a psychosis and a breakdown, but also a recovery, but also a book that is part of your recovery. The writing of the book was
it was very cathartic, and it's helped me understand the world the world that I'm in, and there are moments in the book that I touch upon where one has to try and understand how we are as Black people continually sort of framed as problematic or troublesome, and for speaking up. For when you talk about a Black experience, somehow you're rocking the boat, or you should just play the game. You should just play the white man. Play the game. Don't rock the boat. Don't talk about empire as you do. But these are my legitimate concerns, these are my valid concerns. And if I'm not allowed to talk about them, then I have to bottle them up and screw them down and not address them, and that's further mental trauma. I need to be able to talk about these things. I need to be able to talk about my experience. I think hopefully the book suggests that part of the reason why there is perhaps can be a large number why Black people are overrepresented in the mental health system, particularly in this country and in Britain and in America, in Western countries, is because we are not allowed to express ourselves freely. Somehow that's it's somehow just not on, and that only increases one's mental trauma.
We've got about 70 minutes. I'm going to go to questions. I've got a question here from Holly from London, and she says, you've been doing amazing work as an ambassador for mental health, but there's still a stigma around mental health. And what more can we do to address this and change this? And I think particularly when it comes to the Black community here.
Yeah, I know. I'm astonished about it. But I think generally, times are really tough right now. And people are buckling under the pressure. So you do see, I see it here in New York, and you see it in London. There is a lot of people out there on the street that are suffering. So I think sort of everybody needs to sort of be a little bit more empathetic, and sort of try and understand that person isn't just a crazy person. Something's overloaded with them, and they're disturbed. And so I think, people talk about anxiety all the time. People talk about depression, bipolar. That's, those will almost become cool. Homeland has made bipolar cool. Carrie Matheson has got brilliant moments and chaotic moments. And somehow I think when it comes to the more scary ones, like psychosis or schizophrenia, I think the same thing needs to happen. We need to just slowly start to expand that field of understanding and be a little bit more empathetic when it comes to somebody having a traumatic mental experience, needing to take the day off, needing to take time off work because of their mental health. I think these have to become acceptable practices in the workplace. And I'm glad to see that is happening particularly in the banking world, when it's becoming much more common to see mental health practices in high pressure jobs like that, in law, where people are being encouraged to speak about their mental health. And I think we need to continue down that road and allow people the time to recover if they need things being addressed.
It's been striking, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this, that there've been a number of high profile Black women who have put their mental health very publicly on the record and stepped away from things in order to do some self-repair. There's been Naomi Osaka, the tennis player, Simone Biles, the great gymnast. They've both said on occasions, and they both made decisions on occasions, that they were doing something or not doing something in the interest of their mental health. Is there something about younger people from a younger generation who are more able to admit to mental frailty and more determined to look after themselves?
I think so, yeah. I think the times are changing, and that's great that we have those ambassadors like Naomi, Simone, and not that they got away scot-free for doing that. They didn't. That's important as well. But Ben Stokes did the same thing. England captain did the same thing. And so I think the more our ambassadors or successful people do continue to talk that way and continue to normalize taking a break because of them, in support of their mental health, I think then it will become much more normalized in the workplace and for everybody else to do that. But I strongly encourage people to pay attention to their mental health. Particularly young people, make sure you're sleeping. It sounds so obvious, but if you're not sleeping and you're abusing substances and going out all the time, that's overtaxing your body, it's overtaxing your mind, and that's when mental instability can kind of creep up on you.
I've got another question just come in, but just to remind you, you can still ask questions. Please do give me a name and where you're asking a question from. But there's this one again with no name that's come in. It's, have you had any reactions to your documentary and from the book from people who are working in the mental health professions?
Yes, I have. It's all the time, and I'm very proud that it's become a resource tool for lots of people in mental health. I continue to be stopped in the street by people who I was stopped the other day by a doctor. She just stopped me as I'm walking my dog, and she said, "Excuse me, Mr. I just want to say thank you so much for your documentary, because it's made me think about my patient. And it's opened up, my thinking about my Black patients when they come in. I shouldn't be too blasé about it. I should try and be much more under. It's slightly worrying that she didn't do that before." But I think it's the idea that it's really made her think that there is a component to some of her patients' experience that she has to be cognizant of or aware of. And I think I've been very, very proud of that. I continue to get people, psychiatrists contacting me saying how important it is to discuss these, particularly psychosis, because it's the one big scary one. It's where you get locked up and taken away. Losing your mind is not great, and there is shame attached to it. I don't have any for some reason. I don't know, but having confidently talking about it the way I did really helped the conversation. And again, my DMs are overflowing with people. Some people asking for help, but certainly mental health practitioners who just want to say thank you very much for opening up on this subject and being so open about it. Because the more open I am, the more I talk about that, and the more I can show that I've gone on to achieve success. It's really gives people hope that they can battle their own private shame about their own psychosis. And once they can get over that hump and say, well, you know what, David Harewood had psychosis, and look at him, he's a successful actor. that means I can go on. It doesn't have to be a hindrance to me. So I get a lot of that, and I'm really, really proud that the mental health practitioners see it as a good thing that someone's opening up on that subject.
There's a similar question, but it turns the gaze onto your profession. I'll just read this question. I don't have the name of who it's from. It says, "I'm currently doing a PhD on mental health in actors and working in the industry on improving mental health standards for creative arts workers." What are your thoughts, David, on how that industry, your industry, treats mental health?
Yeah, I think we are in an era of massive change. The Me Too movement has changed things around practices with auditions, with young girls going to people's. You don't have young girls going to old guys' hotel rooms anymore. That was a standard practice before, but the whole Me Too movement has changed that. So I think this conversation is beginning to filter into our profession. There are Equity now have a mental health practitioner who will make themselves known to most productions. But if someone needs a break or someone needs to step back, or if someone's having personal problems, they can at least have someone to talk to. I think we have to. I don't think we're there yet, and it's a results based. It's a business where success is framed in such an odd way. There's a lot of pressures as well on people who are successful. So I think we have to do better, and making mental health practices better in our profession. They're really only just beginning, and the lockdown was partly responsible for that. I mean, here in America, where it's standard practice to work. You work 5 days a week, but it's standard practice that if you haven't filmed everything by Friday, you keep filming until it's all done. So you could find yourself going home 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning. And that was standard practice. But since the pandemic, that's starting to be phased out because people were like, well, I'm never going to see my kids. So again, there's a mental health aspect to that, of overworking people. One actor almost crashed his car, while driving home. So taking care of your products, taking care of your actors is something that it's becoming a little bit more standard practice, but we're really only just at the beginning of that.
I've got a question here, I think a really good question from Murray, who's from Frome in Somerset. And this is what he says: "David, thank you so much for your honesty in talking openly about psychosis and racism within mental health system." He says, "I work in the mental health. In the mental health, research has shown that systemic racism, has existed for years. How do you feel when politicians or media deny institutional racism or become offended when their comfortable positions are challenged?"
Again, you know this yourself, David. It is the ultimate gaslighting when the government released the Sewell report, which almost said it doesn't exist. Almost said that systemic racism doesn't exist. And you will still get black Tory politicians telling you that systemic racism doesn't exist. I don't know why they feel the need to say that, but maybe it's to further their own careers, or maybe they have been extremely lucky in their lives. I don't know, but most of us know that systemic racism exists, that racism exists. So it's frustrating, but again, one can't allow that denial of reality to sway you off course, and it can be exhausting. And
because in itself, to deny your lived experience and to say that it's in your mind is in itself a very damaging thing to do.
Exactly, and that's exactly, as I say, if you're living in an environment that continues to deny your own experience, then that is a really bad place for you to be mentally. Because if people just don't believe you, then you were in trouble.
Another question here, and I'm conscious of time. It says 20. There's no name. It says 22 years old, 23 you were. That's a common age for people to experience psychosis. And that's not information that's widely known. I have to say, when I was in my 20s, I don't think anyone ever raised the issue or told me I was in a moment in my life when I was more vulnerable to psychosis than others. The question asks, do you think education about this issue is needed?
I do. I think education, much more talk, much more conversation about it. I think, I'm not, I think that there is, I do think there is a spiritual element to it. I don't think that because there are many people, particularly in the Black community, who deal with psychosis themselves, who find a way of managing it, and who actually wouldn't live without that experience, that edge. They find that it gives them a little something, and it is an extraordinary experience to go through. But there are elements of real euphoria and real clear thinking, and I think we're only at the beginning of harnessing exactly what it's about. Yes, there's a lot of things misfiring in the brain, a lot of confusion around, because every psychotic experience is particular to the person that's going through it. There's no one has two psychosis. So my medication might be different to your medication, might be different to somebody else's medication. They're all very, very different and peculiar experiences. But I'm convinced that there is in other parts of the world, if somebody's going through a psychotic break, or a psychotic experience rather, people will go and talk to them because they are seen as truth speakers. So I think there is something extremely special about the experience. Obviously, there's some deeply traumatic experiences as well, and a lot of pain and delusions and hallucinations are a common factor of psychosis. So it's important for us to, rather than where do those delusions and hallucinations come from? I mean, it's such an extraordinary experience. Now the voice of Martin Luther King appearing to me in my head. I've never felt anything like it before in my life. But I do like to think that there is an element of spirituality to it as well. And I think we need to find other ways, not just of speaking about it, but of experiencing it and of treating it too.
David Harewood, thank you once again for talking about this issue with such insight, with such personal frankness and honesty. I'm a huge fan, as you know, of the book. I think it's an enormous contribution to conversations which need to be had, but for many people, and for many years, have just been pushed to the sideline. I hope we've been able to answer some of your questions. I hope that you found the conversation illuminating, and I also hope you go out and buy David's book, I Don't Belong Here. Guardian Live have more sessions coming up, including next week, a session called Do Our Children Need More Black History Lessons? You can find out more at guardian.com/Guardian Live. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this event, so please do take a moment and do fill out our survey at the end. And finally, thank you so much for joining us this evening, and an enormous thanks, and I'm looking forward to seeing you when you get home, David Harewood.
Thank you, sir.
Good night.